The night before his extravagant wedding, a millionaire freezes mid-toast. His ex-wife is here, but not as a guest. She's cleaning tables, visibly pregnant. The moment their eyes meet, the air shifts, and memories of their love and his mistakes come flooding back. He thought he'd moved on, but now, with his past standing before him, he's forced to ask, did he let go of the woman he was meant to spend forever with? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Reed Patterson adjusted his custom Italian cufflinks as he surveyed the immaculate scene before him. The waterfront estate's grand terrace glowed with hundreds of twinkling lights reflected in the calm waters beyond. Crystal glasses clinked. Soft laughter mingled with the string quartet's melody, and waitstaff in crisp black uniforms glided between clusters of the city's elite. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be for the rehearsal dinner before his wedding to Vanessa Blackwell. So why did he feel nothing? Reed forced a smile as another guest approached with congratulations. The man was the CEO of a shipping rival, someone who'd matter to tomorrow's merger discussions. Reed shook his hand firmly, made appropriate small talk, then watched him move toward Vanessa, who stood holding court near the champagne fountain. She looked stunning in her designer dress, her dark hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the diamond earrings he'd given her last month. Beautiful, poised, connected, the perfect partner for a man of his position. The logical next step for his empire. 5 minutes until your toast, darling, Vanessa called across the terrace, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Reed nodded, patting the note cards in his jacket pocket. He'd prepared remarks that would impress, words about strategic partnerships and bright futures. Nothing too sentimental. Nothing that would make his chest ache like it inexplicably did now. He turned toward the bar when he saw her. Time stopped. Isabel, his ex-wife of only 8 months, moved between guests with a tray of empty appetizer plates. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple knot, her black catering uniform a stark contrast to the designer gowns surrounding her. But what made Reed's breath catch painfully in his chest was the unmistakable curve of her belly beneath the uniform. Isabel was pregnant. A flood of memories crashed through Reed's carefully constructed composure. Isabel laughing in their kitchen, flour on her cheek as she attempted to bake his favorite cookies. The way she'd curl against him during thunderstorms, claiming to be afraid, though he knew she only wanted to comfort him. Her unwavering support when he'd secured his first major shipping contract, believing in him when nobody else would. How long had it been since he'd thought of these moments? How had he locked them away so completely? Reed, everyone's waiting. Vanessa's voice sounded distant through the roaring in his ears. He moved to the center of the terrace mechanically, raising his champagne glass. The crowd quieted. Reed glanced down at his note cards, the carefully crafted words suddenly meaningless. I want to thank you all for joining us to celebrate. His voice faltered as he looked up and caught Isabel's eyes across the room. She'd frozen in place, her hazel eyes wide with recognition. The tray in her hands trembled slightly. 8 months of silence stretched between them like an ocean. Reed abandoned his prepared speech mid-sentence. Without conscious decision, he found himself moving across the terrace toward her, drawn by some force he couldn't name. Guests parted before him, murmuring in confusion. Isabel nearly dropped her tray when their eyes locked. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped it tighter, her face paling beneath her professional mask. Isabel, he whispered, close enough now to see the faint freckles across her nose that summer always intensified. Reed! Her voice was barely audible. I shouldn't be here. I didn't know this was your... Reed! Vanessa's sharp voice sliced through their moment. Everyone is waiting for your toast, darling. The spell broke. Isabel stepped back, professional mask sliding back into place, though her eyes remained turbulent. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, slipping away toward the kitchen. Reed returned to his position, somehow finishing his toast while his mind replayed every moment with Isabel. The words came automatically while his thoughts churned with questions. How far along was she? Was she well? Why was she working as catering staff when she'd been one of the city's most sought-after event planners? Throughout the evening, Reed struggled to focus on his guests. He watched Vanessa work the crowd, noting how her smile brightened for those with influence and dimmed for those without. She touched the arm of a banking executive warmly while barely acknowledging the man's wife. When had he started noticing these things? His eyes kept searching for Isabel, catching glimpses of her as she moved efficiently through the party. Each sighting sent another memory crashing through him, making his imminent marriage feel increasingly surreal. Later that evening, Reed stared at the ceiling of his master bedroom, the grandfather clock in the hallway chiming 3 in the morning. Sleep remained impossibly distant. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabel, her surprised expression, the gentle curve of her pregnant belly, the quiet dignity with which she'd carried herself despite serving the very people who once considered her a peer. With a frustrated groan, he threw back the covers and moved to the window overlooking the harbor. The moonlight glinted off the water, illuminating the yachts bobbing gently at their moorings. Everything he'd worked for lay spread before him: the mansion, the fleet, the impending merger that would be cemented by tomorrow's wedding. Yet all of it felt hollow. By dawn, Reed had made his decision. He called Vanessa before she could begin her wedding day preparations. "What do you mean, cancel?" Her voice turned glacial. "The cathedral is booked. 400 guests are expecting—" "I can't marry you," Reed interrupted, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It wouldn't be fair to either of us." The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By afternoon, his phone exploded with calls from outraged guests, business associates, and tabloid reporters. The society pages blared headlines about Patterson's wedding day disaster. Vanessa's father threatened to pull out of their pending business deal. Reed ignored it all, focused on the only thing that suddenly mattered. Through his assistant, he obtained Isabel's address, a modest apartment building in a working-class neighborhood he'd never visited. The stairwell smelled of old carpet and someone's lingering dinner. Reed climbed to the 3rd floor, hesitating before knocking on apartment 3C. The door opened to reveal Isabel in worn jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Shock registered on her face. "Reed, what are you—" "May I come in?" he asked quietly. She hesitated before stepping aside. The apartment was small but meticulously organized. A pile of textbooks sat on a folding table beside a laptop. A waitress uniform hung on the bathroom door, visible through the hallway. A barista apron draped over a kitchen chair. "You're working multiple jobs," Reed observed, the reality of her situation hitting him with physical force. Isabel crossed her arms protectively. "I do what I need to do." "What happened to your event planning business?" Her laugh held no humor. "Being accused of corporate espionage tends to destroy one's professional reputation. I was blacklisted after our divorce." Reed felt the weight of that statement. He'd believed the worst of her, never questioning the evidence Gilbert had presented against her. "The baby," he said finally, his eyes drawn to her belly. "Is it yours?" Isabel's voice softened slightly. "Yes. Remember that night after signing the divorce papers?" Reed remembered. Their goodbye had been intense, desperate. A final connection neither had planned, but neither could resist. They'd made love with all the passion of their beginning and all the sorrow of their ending. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Isabel's protective walls visibly rose. "You accused me of betraying your company. You believed I'd sell your shipping routes to your competitors." Her voice caught. You made it abundantly clear you wanted nothing to do with me. Reed moved toward the window, needing distance to process. Outside, the neighborhood bustled with ordinary life. Children playing, people returning from work, a couple walking hand in hand. "I called off the wedding," he said abruptly. Isabel's eyes widened. "What? When?" "This morning. Because of..." She gestured vaguely to her belly. "Because seeing you last night made me realize I've been living someone else's version of my life." Reed turned to face her. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow?" "To discuss the baby's future." Isabel studied him, wariness evident in her stance. "Just dinner? Just talk?" Reed nodded. "That's all I'm asking for." "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "But somewhere quiet. I've had enough of being stared at by your social circle." 2 nights later, they sat across from each other at a small Italian restaurant far from their usual haunts. The conversation started awkwardly, stilted with politeness and careful distance. "How are you feeling?" Reed asked, gesturing toward her belly. "Tired, hungry all the time. The morning sickness has mostly passed," Isabel replied, unconsciously placing a protective hand on her growing bump. The simple gesture struck Reed with unexpected force. That was his child beneath her palm. A life they'd created together, however unintentionally. As their meals arrived, something of their old rhythm gradually returned. Isabel laughed genuinely at something Reed said, the sound so familiar it made his chest ache. For a brief moment, they were simply Reed and Isabel again, sharing a meal and conversation as they had hundreds of times before. "Do you know if it's a boy or girl?" Reed asked as they lingered over dessert. "Not yet." Isabel's expression softened. "I find out next week." Would you mind if I came to the appointment?" Surprise flickered across her face, followed by cautious consideration. "I'll think about it," she said finally. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Reed couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had taken root since seeing Isabel at his rehearsal dinner. Sitting in his office, he pulled out the file containing the evidence of her alleged corporate espionage, the evidence that had destroyed their marriage 8 months ago. The shipping route information had definitely leaked to competitors. That much was true. But as Reed reviewed the timeline and documentation Gilbert had provided, inconsistencies began to emerge. The leaked information had gone through Isabel's email account, but the timestamps didn't align with her known whereabouts that day. She'd been at a charity event, with witnesses, when the email was sent. Reed frowned, flipping through more pages. Gilbert had been the one to discover the breach, the one who'd brought the evidence directly to Reed, the same Gilbert who was Vanessa's uncle, the same Gilbert who had immediately suggested Vanessa as a potential business partner after Isabel was gone. "What am I missing?" Reed muttered, spreading the documents across his desk. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Patterson, Ms. Blackwell is here to see you." Reed sighed, quickly gathering the papers. "Send her in." Vanessa swept into his office wearing an impeccably tailored suit, her dark hair styled to perfection. "Darling, I've been trying to reach you for days," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. When he stiffened, she pulled back with a practiced pout. "Are you still upset? I've been so patient with this temporary insanity of yours." "It's not temporary, Vanessa. The wedding is off." She perched on the edge of his desk, crossing her legs. "Reed, darling, you're just having cold feet. It's normal, but think about what we could build together." Her voice dropped to a silky tone. "The Blackwell-Patterson merger would be unstoppable. Uncle Gilbert says..." "Gilbert says a lot of things," Reed interrupted, suddenly alert at the mention of her uncle. "Tell me, how much do you know about what happened with Isabel?" Vanessa's expression hardened momentarily before she composed herself. "Only that she betrayed you, sold your shipping routes." She reached for his hand. "I would never do that to you, Reed. Our alliance is much more..." advantageous. Not once had she mentioned love, Reed realized. Not once had she spoken about anything beyond business advantages and social position. "I have a meeting," he said abruptly. "We'll talk later." Later that afternoon, Reed stopped at his favorite cafe downtown. He needed space to think, away from his office where Gilbert might interrupt. The cozy corner spot had been his refuge for years. He was halfway through his coffee when the bell above the door chimed. Isabel walked in, her pregnant belly more prominent in the simple dress she wore. Reed instinctively shrank back into his corner, not ready to be seen, but unable to look away. "Isabel," the barista greeted her warmly. "The usual today?" "Please, Marco. How's your daughter doing with those college applications?" The barista launched into a story about his daughter's scholarship prospects while preparing Isabel's drink. Reed watched, struck by how genuinely interested she seemed, asking follow-up questions and offering encouragement. When another employee dropped a tray of mugs with a crash, Isabel immediately knelt to help gather the pieces, waving off the young man's embarrassed apologies. "Don't worry about it. My first job was in a cafe, and I broke something at least once a shift." The contrast with Vanessa, who had snapped at a waiter just last week for bringing the wrong wine, couldn't have been more stark. As Isabel stood from helping clean up, she swayed slightly, one hand flying to her temple. Reed was on his feet before he could think, crossing the room and steadying her with a hand at her lower back. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Isabel looked up, surprised. "Reed, I'm fine, just got up too quickly. The doctor says my blood pressure drops sometimes." His hand remained at her back, the touch feeling both foreign and achingly familiar. "Maybe you should sit down." The cafe door opened again, and Vanessa's voice cut through the moment. "Reed, what are you doing here?" Her gaze shifted to Isabel, then to Reed's hand still supporting her. "And with her." Isabel stiffened, stepping away from Reed's touch. "I was just leaving." "No," Reed said firmly. "You should sit. Finish your tea." Vanessa's perfect smile didn't reach her eyes. "Isn't this sweet? Playing the concerned father already?" She turned to the barista. "I'll have a non-fat latte, and make it quick. Some of us have actual jobs to get back to." The barista's friendly demeanor cooled noticeably. "Yes, ma'am." Reed watched the interaction, something fundamental shifting inside him. 8 months ago, he had chosen to believe the worst about Isabel without giving her a chance to defend herself. He had trusted Gilbert implicitly, never questioning the evidence presented. Looking between the two women, Vanessa with her cold calculation, Isabel with her quiet dignity, despite everything she'd endured, Reed was increasingly certain he had made a terrible mistake. The next day, Reed paced his home office, phone pressed to his ear. "No, I need those shipping manifests from last quarter, all of them." He glanced at the stack of financial reports on his desk. Something wasn't adding up in the company's Eastern European routes that Gilbert had personally overseen after Isabel's departure. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Isabel stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter. "I can come back," she said, gesturing to his phone call. Reed shook his head, waving her in. "I'll call you back," he told the person on the other end, then hung up. "Perfect timing, actually. I've been thinking about something." Isabel lowered herself carefully into the chair across from his desk, her pregnancy making her movements more deliberate. "About the baby? Because I told you, I don't need—" "About a job," Reed interrupted. "For you." Her expression immediately closed off. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity, it's a business proposition." Reed leaned forward. "I need someone who understands my company's operations but isn't currently part of the system. Someone who can help me investigate discrepancies without raising suspicions." "You want me to help you investigate Gilbert?" It wasn't a question. Reed nodded. "You were always better at seeing patterns than I was." and you know the company inside and out. Why would I help you? Isabel asked, her voice soft but firm. After everything that happened. Because I'll pay you 3 times what you're making at your current jobs combined. When she started to protest, he added, and because I think you were set up. I think we both were. Isabel sat silently, one hand absently rubbing her belly. Finally, she sighed. My rent just went up, and the doctor says I need to reduce stress. She met his gaze directly. I'll do it. But this is strictly professional, Reed. I'm not coming back to you. Of course, he agreed quickly. Strictly business. 3 days later, Isabel had transformed a corner of Reed's home office into her workspace. Files were neatly arranged, color-coded tabs marking important sections. Reed watched her work from across the room, struck by how naturally she fit into the space, as if the 8 months apart had never happened. She rose to refill her water glass and paused by the coffee machine. Without asking, she prepared a cup exactly how he liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream, and set it on his desk before returning to her notes. Thank you, he said, surprised. She shrugged without looking up. You always get grumpy around 3 without caffeine. The casual observation, so intimate in its knowledge of his habits, hung in the air between them. Later, when Reed returned from a phone call, he found Isabel had reorganized his chaotic notes into a coherent system. She was standing at the whiteboard, mapping connections between shipping dates and financial discrepancies. Look at this, she said, tapping the board. These routes consistently show losses on paper, but the inventory numbers don't match the reported cargo. Someone's skimming, and they're using my supposed leak as cover. Reed moved beside her, studying her work. You've found more in 3 days than my team did in weeks. That's because your team is afraid to implicate Gilbert. I'm not. She circled a set of numbers. These are the routes he personally oversees. They were standing close, the familiar scent of her shampoo bringing back memories of countless evenings spent like this, working through problems together, finishing each other's thoughts. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. The doorbell shattered the moment. I'm not expecting anyone, Reed frowned, checking his watch. Moments later, his housekeeper showed Gilbert into the office. The older man stopped abruptly when he saw Isabel. What is she doing here? Gilbert's voice was controlled, but Reed didn't miss the flash of something. Anger, fear, in his eyes. Consulting on some operational issues, Reed replied calmly. Isabel has unique insights into our logistics systems. Gilbert's jaw tightened. Reed, may I speak with you privately? Anything you need to say can be said in front of my consultant, Reed replied, deliberately emphasizing her position. After a tense conversation where Gilbert warned against reopening old wounds, the older man left, his normally composed demeanor visibly rattled. When the front door closed, Reed turned to Isabel. You saw that, right? She nodded. He's definitely hiding something. Reed sank into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Do you know what's been the worst part of these past 8 months? Not the business headaches or the social embarrassment. He stared at his hands. It's coming home to this empty house, having no one to talk to about any of it. I have everything I thought I wanted: success, wealth, status. And I've never been lonelier. The vulnerability in his admission hung in the air. Isabel hesitated, then crossed the room and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. The touch was brief, but carried the weight of their shared history. It's getting late, she said softly, withdrawing her hand. I should go. Reed nodded, but long after she left, he could still feel the warmth of her touch on his shoulder. Next evening, both are still busy analyzing. Reed's eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. The office clock read 1:38 a.m., but he couldn't stop now. Across the room, Isabel sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by financial reports, her honey blonde hair falling from its practical ponytail. Reed, "Look at this," she called, her voice tense with discovery. "These transfer authorizations, they're all backdated to make it look like information left the company the week I had access to the server." He crossed the room and knelt beside her, their shoulders nearly touching as he examined the documents. "But that's impossible," he said. "These contracts weren't even finalized until 3 weeks later," Isabel finished. "Someone created a paper trail after the fact." She pulled another folder forward. "And look who signed off on all the security protocol changes that week." Reed stared at Gilbert's distinctive signature on form after form. "He created backdoors in our system and then blamed the breach on you." "He needed a scapegoat," Isabel said quietly. "Someone you'd believe had betrayed you." The implication hung heavy between them. Gilbert, his mentor, his trusted advisor, had orchestrated everything, manipulating Reed into believing the worst about the woman he loved. They worked in focused silence for another hour, connecting more pieces of Gilbert's deception. When Reed looked up from a particularly damning email chain, he noticed Isabel had dozed off on the leather couch, one hand protectively curved over her belly. He watched her for a moment, struck by a fierce protectiveness he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Quietly, he removed his jacket and draped it over her sleeping form. The simple act of caring for her again felt so natural, so right, that his chest tightened with emotion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. Morning light filtered through the blinds when Isabel stirred. She blinked, momentarily confused to find herself covered with Reed's jacket, its familiar scent enveloping her. Reed appeared with a mug of herbal tea. "I remembered you can't have caffeine," he said, setting it on the side table. "Thank you." She sat up slowly, self-consciously smoothing her rumpled clothes. Reed sat in the armchair opposite her, his own coffee cradled between his hands. "We need to talk about what we found last night." "Gilbert betrayed you," she said simply. "He set me up to take the fall." "He betrayed us both," Reed corrected. He hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "But I'm the one who didn't trust you. I'm the one who believed the worst without giving you a chance to explain." Isabel took a careful sip of tea, her expression guarded. "I've been thinking about why I was so quick to believe you'd betray me," Reed continued. "With Vanessa, everything was about appearances, connections, status. But with you," his voice softened, "you knew me when I had nothing. You loved me before the money, before the success." "I loved you for you," Isabel said quietly. "I always challenged you when I thought you were wrong. And I needed that. I miss that, the authenticity we had." He leaned forward. "What I don't understand is why you didn't fight the accusations, why you accepted the divorce without contesting anything." Isabel set down her mug, her hands trembling slightly. "Because Gilbert gave me no choice." "What do you mean?" "He came to me the day after you accused me of the leak. He said if I fought the divorce or tried to clear my name, he would make sure your company collapsed completely." Her voice was steady, despite the pain in her eyes. "He had evidence of financial irregularities he claimed would trigger a federal investigation. He said he'd make it look like you were involved." Reed stared at her, stunned. "You sacrificed your reputation to protect me? My company?" "I couldn't let him destroy everything you'd worked for," she said simply. "Even if you hated me for something I didn't do." The realization crashed over Reed like a wave. While he'd been nursing his wounded pride, Isabel had been sacrificing everything, her career, her reputation, their marriage, to protect him. "Isabel." He moved to the couch beside her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her sacrifice. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The touch was electric, charged with months of separation and newfound understanding. Isabel's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she leaned into his touch before stepping back, creating distance between them. "We should focus on the evidence," she said, but her voice wavered, betraying the emotion she was trying to contain. Reed nodded, respecting her boundary even as the electricity between them remained undeniable. Everything had changed with her revelation. The wall of mistrust he'd built was crumbling, replaced by a painful clarity about what he'd thrown away and what Gilbert had stolen from them both. Reed frowned at his watch as he waited for Isabel outside the Morgan Industries corporate event. She'd been working with him all day on the investigation, then rushed to this catering job despite his objections. It was too much for her, for anyone, in her condition. When the venue doors finally opened and staff began filtering out, Reed straightened, searching for her familiar figure. He spotted her colleague Maria first, then saw Isabel trailing behind, her face alarmingly pale. "Isabel," he called, moving toward her. She looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes before they rolled back. Reed lunged forward, catching her just before she hit the ground. "Isabel." His heart hammered against his ribs as he cradled her against his chest. "Someone call an ambulance." "I'm fine," she mumbled, trying to push herself up. "Just dizzy." "You're not fine." Reed's voice was firm as he brushed damp hair from her forehead. "You're working yourself to exhaustion." The ambulance arrived within minutes. When the paramedics tried to separate them, Reed's expression hardened. "I'm coming with her." At the hospital, a nurse blocked his path to the examination room. "Family only, sir." "I'm the father of her baby," Reed said without hesitation. The words felt right on his tongue, natural and true in a way that surprised him. The nurse studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." Hours later, Isabel lay in a hospital bed, diagnosed with dehydration and exhaustion. The doctor had been clear. She needed rest, proper nutrition, and significantly reduced stress. "You can't keep going like this," Reed said softly, sitting beside her bed. "The baby is fine," Isabel finished, though the worry in her eyes betrayed her. "I don't have a choice, Reed. Bills don't pay themselves. Let me help you." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Not just financially. I want to be involved. With everything." Isabel turned her face away. "I can't depend on you again." "I know I've given you every reason not to trust me," Reed acknowledged, "but I'm asking for a chance to prove that's changed." The next morning, Reed arrived with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Isabel blinked in surprise as he unpacked her favorite nightgown, the lavender-scented lotion she used every night, and a well-worn copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion. "You remembered," she whispered, fingering the book's familiar spine. "Of course I did." Reed placed a tin of her preferred pregnancy-safe herbal tea on the bedside table. "You read it every time you were sick or upset." He'd gone to her apartment, remembering exactly where she kept each item. It was such an intimate act of care that Isabel felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. A nurse entered, smiling warmly at Reed. "Dad, would you like to stay for the ultrasound? We want to check that the little one is handling Mommy's stress okay." Neither of them corrected her. Instead, Reed's eyes sought Isabel's, silently asking permission. She nodded slightly, and he moved closer to the bed, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. As the nurse spread gel across Isabel's rounded belly, Reed's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, the room filled with the rapid whooshing of their baby's heartbeat. "Strong heartbeat," the nurse commented. "Baby looks perfect." Relief washed over Isabel, and she squeezed Reed's hand without thinking. When their eyes met, something shifted between them, a moment of shared joy, of possibility. Later that afternoon, as Reed arranged fresh flowers by her bed, Isabel gasped suddenly. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarm crossing his features. "Nothing." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen in months. "The baby's kicking. Really kicking, not just fluttering." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it on the curve of her belly. Reed went still, his eyes widening as he felt the distinct pressure against his palm. "That's our baby," he whispered, awe transforming his face. The word "our" hung between them, weighted with everything they'd lost and everything that might still be possible. Tears gathered in Isabel's eyes as Reed's thumb gently stroked the spot where their child had kicked. "We made this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Together." For that suspended moment, the betrayals and hurt of the past 8 months faded. They were simply two people connected by the life they'd created, overwhelmed by what might have been, and what still could be. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the hallway. Gilbert Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he observed their intimate moment, his jaw tightening with calculation and fury. His phone was already in his hand, plans forming to ensure Isabel Winters would never threaten his position in Reed's life again. One crisp morning, Gilbert Blackwell drummed his fingers on his mahogany desk, his grandfatherly smile failing to reach his calculating eyes as Vanessa paced before him. "This is your chance to reclaim what's rightfully yours," he told his niece. "Reed is confused, letting sentiment cloud his judgment." Vanessa stopped pacing, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "He canceled our wedding for her. After everything I've done to secure our position." Gilbert's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The timing of this pregnancy is convenient, wouldn't you say? 8 months after their divorce, who's to say the child is even Reed's?" Understanding dawned on Vanessa's face. "You think she's manipulating him?" "I think a desperate woman with mounting bills might see Reed as her meal ticket." Gilbert shrugged. "People are already talking. It would be a shame if those whispers reached the right ears." Within days, the rumors spread through Reed's business circles. At the quarterly investor gala, whispers followed Isabel's name: gold digger, opportunist, questions about paternity. Reed noticed the sidelong glances from associates, the abrupt ends to conversations when he approached. He was discussing expansion plans with 2 board members when he overheard a nearby conversation. Probably trapped him with that baby. Classic move. Reed's jaw tightened. He excused himself and strode toward the gossiping group. "If you have questions about my personal life," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I suggest you ask me directly instead of spreading malicious speculation." The room fell silent as Reed continued. "Isabel Winters is carrying my child. Anyone suggesting otherwise is not only incorrect but unwelcome in my business ventures moving forward." From the doorway, Isabel froze, clutching a portfolio of documents she'd come to deliver. She hadn't expected to find Reed in a room full of the city's elite, much less defending her honor. Vanessa pushed through the crowd, her smile brittle. "Darling, you're making a scene over the help." She glanced dismissively at Isabel. "Let's discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss." Reed's voice was quiet but firm. "Isabel deserves respect, not gossip. And she was never the help. She was my wife." "You're choosing her over everything we've built?" Vanessa's voice rose. "Over me?" "I'm choosing the truth," Reed replied. "And yes, her reputation over social standing. Every time." Vanessa's composure cracked. She slapped Reed hard across the face before storming out, leaving stunned silence in her wake. Reed found Isabel still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. Without hesitation, he crossed to her, gently taking the portfolio and her elbow, guiding her away from prying eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered once they were alone. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." 3 days later, Isabel stood uncertainly on Reed's doorstep. He had called that morning, asking her to come for dinner to discuss the baby. She hadn't expected to be greeted by the scent of saffron and seafood when he opened the door. The dining room stopped her in her tracks. Candles flickered in hurricane lamps. A vase held purple irises. Her favorites, not roses. The table was set with the blue plates she'd always loved, not his formal china. "What is this?" she asked, her voice catching. Reed looked almost shy. "Paella, with extra mussels, light on the chorizo." Exactly how she preferred it. Just like on their first date at that tiny Spanish restaurant where they'd sat at a wobbly table and talked until the owner had to ask them to leave. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remember everything." Reed pulled out her chair. "The wine you drank before you swore off alcohol completely when we started trying for a baby. How you fold your napkin in your lap. The way you saved the biggest mussel for last." As they ate, he recalled details she'd forgotten herself. How she'd worn her hair up but kept touching the loose strand by her ear. How she'd laughed when he spilled sangria on his shirt. How they'd walked 3 miles home because neither wanted the night to end. "Why are you doing this?" Isabel finally asked, setting down her fork. Reed's expression grew serious. "Because losing you was the greatest regret of my life. Not just because of the baby, but because what we had was real. I chose pride and business over the one person who loved me for myself." He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I was wrong about everything that mattered." The candlelight caught the moisture in his eyes, and Isabel felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the gravitational pull that had always existed between them. Their lips were inches apart when she pulled back suddenly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't," she whispered. "I want to, but I'm terrified of trusting you again. Last time nearly broke me." Reed nodded, not pressuring her to close the distance. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, or maybe ever, but I'm asking for a chance to be part of our child's life, to prove my transformation is genuine." He squeezed her hands gently. "Even if you can't forgive me personally, I'll spend every day showing you that I've changed." The sincerity in his eyes made her heart ache with possibility and fear in equal measure. "One day at a time," she finally said. "That's all I can promise." For Reed, it was enough to begin. Gilbert smiled as he adjusted his tie, watching the weather forecast on his office television. The meteorologist pointed to a massive storm system approaching the coast, predicting high winds and flooding. Perfect. "Everything is arranged at the lakeside property," he told Vanessa over the phone. "Isabel believes Reed requested her presence for this emergency business retreat. By the time she realizes he's not coming, the roads will be impassable." "And what exactly does this accomplish?" Vanessa asked. "Reed will believe she's abandoned their project just when we present our alternative proposal. Her phone won't have service, and she'll miss the board meeting. It's elegant, really." What Gilbert didn't mention was how isolated the property would be during the storm, a calculated risk he was willing to take to separate Reed from Isabel permanently. Isabel glanced anxiously at the darkening sky through the cabin window. She'd arrived 2 hours ago at the secluded lakeside property, but Reed was nowhere to be found. Her calls went straight to voicemail, and now her phone showed no service at all. The wind howled, bending trees at alarming angles as rain lashed against the windows. She jumped when a branch crashed onto the roof. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, rubbing her swollen belly. "Reed wouldn't send me here alone." A sharp pain gripped her abdomen, making her gasp and clutch the kitchen counter. When it passed, she checked her watch. 10 minutes later, another contraction hit, stronger this time. "No, no, no," she whispered, fear rising in her throat. "It's too early." She was alone, in labor, with no way to call for help as the storm intensified around her. Reed slammed his office door, fury radiating from every pore. "What do you mean Isabel went to the lake house? I never scheduled a retreat there." His assistant looked confused. "Mr. Blackwell confirmed everything. He said you'd meet her there this afternoon to prepare for tomorrow's board meeting." A chill ran down Reed's spine as he checked the weather radar on his computer. The approaching storm was now classified as dangerous, with flash flood warnings across the region. "Gilbert, he growled, pieces falling into place. The lake house road flooded easily. He'd be lucky to reach it before it became impassable. Reed grabbed his keys, ignoring his assistant's protests about the danger. Cancel tomorrow's meeting and find Gilbert. Tell him he's fired. The drive was a nightmare. Twice Reed had to detour around fallen trees, and water already covered sections of the road. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as his SUV hydroplaned through a deep puddle. "Hold on, Isabel," he whispered, his heart pounding with fear. Not for himself, but for her and their unborn child. For the first time in his life, Reed prayed. Not for his company or reputation, but for the chance to be the husband and father he should have been all along. The thought of losing Isabel again, this time permanently, was unbearable. The idea of never meeting their child made his chest constrict with a pain he'd never experienced. "I can't fail them both," he said through gritted teeth as he navigated around a fallen power line. "Not when I've just found my way back." Isabel paced the cabin floor, timing contractions that were now 8 minutes apart. She'd gathered towels, boiled water, and found a first aid kit, but terror gripped her at the thought of delivering prematurely without medical help. Between contractions, she tried the landline repeatedly, but the storm had knocked out service. Rain hammered the roof like gunfire, and the wind's howl had become a roar. During a particularly strong contraction, she didn't hear the door burst open. It wasn't until she felt warm hands supporting her that she realized she wasn't alone. "Reed!" she gasped, turning to find him soaked to the skin, his face pale with worry. "I'm here," he said, helping her to the couch. "Gilbert set this up. I came as soon as I realized." "The baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's too early, Reed. I'm scared." Reed knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me. We're going to get through this together. I won't leave you. Not ever again." He brushed wet hair from her face with trembling fingers. "I love you, Isabel. I never stopped. And I'll do anything, risk anything, for you and our child." Another contraction gripped her, and she squeezed his hands so tightly her knuckles went white. Reed coached her through breathing, his steady voice a lifeline in her pain. When it passed, Isabel looked into his eyes and saw not the ambitious businessman who had divorced her, but the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who had always been there beneath the surface. "I still love you too," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I tried so hard not to." Reed pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't deserve your love, but I promise to earn it every day for the rest of our lives." He helped her change positions as another contraction began, supporting her weight, wiping her brow, and murmuring encouragement. His hands were steady even as fear coursed through him. In that moment, as thunder crashed overhead and Isabel clung to him through her pain, Reed's transformation was complete. Nothing mattered but the woman in his arms and the child they had created together. Days later, Reed frantically searched the cabin for anything useful, while Isabel gripped the edge of the couch through another contraction. The landline was dead, but he discovered his cell phone had 1 bar of service, just enough to make an emergency call. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the static. Reed hesitated for only a second. "My wife is in premature labor. We're stranded at Lake Windermere cabin during the storm. Roads are flooded." As he explained their situation, Isabel cried out. Reed rushed back to her side, phone pressed to his ear. "Sir, emergency services can't reach you until the storm subsides. I'm connecting you with Dr. Hayes. She'll talk you through this." Reed's face drained of color. "We need to deliver the baby ourselves." The doctor's calm voice came on the line. "Mr. Patterson, I understand you're scared, but women have been giving birth for thousands of years. I'll guide you through every step." He put the phone on speaker and knelt beside Isabel, taking her trembling hand. "The doctor's going to help us. We can do this." Isabel's eyes widened with terror. "Reed, I can't. It's too early." "Look at me," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You are the strongest person I've ever known. You survived losing everything, your career, your reputation, me, and still created a beautiful life for our child. If anyone can do this, it's you." Dr. Hayes guided them through preparing the space. Clean towels beneath Isabel, boiled water cooling nearby, first aid supplies within reach. Reed followed every instruction with unwavering focus, his hands steady despite his racing heart. As Isabel's contractions intensified, Reed became her anchor. He wiped sweat from her brow, supported her back, and breathed with her through each wave of pain. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured, his face inches from hers. Just like that. Between contractions, Isabel clutched his hand. "Don't leave me." "Never again," he promised, his eyes never leaving hers. "You and this baby are my whole world." Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, nothing existed except their shared struggle to bring their child safely into the world. When Dr. Hayes announced it was time to push, fear flickered across Isabel's exhausted face. "I can't do it anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Reed cupped her face in his hands. "Yes, you can. We've come too far to give up now. I believe in you, Isabel. I always have." Something in his voice reached her. With renewed determination, Isabel bore down with the next contraction. Suddenly, Dr. Hayes's voice sharpened with concern. "The baby's heart rate is dropping. She needs to deliver now." Reed felt panic rise in his chest but forced it down. "Isabel, look at me. Our baby needs you to be stronger than you've ever been. One more big push." With a cry that tore at Reed's soul, Isabel gave everything she had. Moments later, a tiny, perfect cry filled the cabin. "She's here," Reed whispered in awe, tears streaming down his face as he followed the doctor's instructions to clean their daughter's airways and wrap her in a clean towel. "Our little girl is here." But his triumph was short-lived as he turned to see Isabel's eyes fluttering closed, her skin alarmingly pale. "She's bleeding too much," he told the doctor, fear strangling his voice. Dr. Hayes's instructions came rapidly. Reed worked with desperate precision, applying pressure and elevating Isabel's legs while murmuring constant reassurances. "Stay with me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I can't do this without you. Our daughter needs her mother." Just as Reed feared all was lost, the distant thrum of helicopter blades cut through the storm. Emergency services had found a break in the weather. Within minutes, medical professionals filled the cabin. As they prepared Isabel and the baby for transport, Reed refused to release either of their hands. At the hospital, after Isabel was stabilized, Reed sat beside her bed, their tiny daughter swaddled in his arms. When Isabel's eyes finally opened, they immediately sought their child. "She's perfect," Reed whispered, carefully transferring their daughter into Isabel's waiting arms. "Just like her mother." Isabel watched, tears gathering in her eyes, as Reed leaned down to kiss their daughter's forehead. "I promise to protect you both," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve this second chance, but I'll spend every day of my life proving I'm worthy of it." In that moment, seeing the tenderness in his eyes, Isabel began to believe that Reed's transformation might truly be real. While Isabel and their newborn daughter slept peacefully in the hospital room, Reed sat in an uncomfortable chair nearby, his laptop balanced on his knees. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he combed through years of company emails. Something Gilbert had said during their last confrontation had triggered a memory, a passing reference to correspondence that should have been deleted. Reed rubbed his tired eyes and clicked on another folder of archived messages. Suddenly, he froze. There it was, an email chain Gilbert had forgotten to purge completely. Reed's heart pounded as he read through the messages. Gilbert had orchestrated the entire corporate espionage scheme, deliberately planting false evidence implicating Isabel while secretly selling company information to competitors. "Son of a bitch," Reed whispered, glancing quickly at Isabel to make sure he hadn't disturbed her. His hands trembled with rage as he forwarded the emails to his secure account and printed copies at the nurse's station. The next morning, after making sure Isabel and the baby were comfortable, Reed drove straight to the office. He found Gilbert alone in the boardroom, reviewing quarterly reports. "I know what you did," Reed said, his voice dangerously quiet as he dropped the printed emails on the table. Gilbert's face paled as he scanned the documents. "Where did you get these?" "You were always too arrogant to be thorough," Reed replied. "You destroyed my marriage. You made me believe Isabel betrayed me when she was protecting me all along." Gilbert's expression hardened. "Everything I did was for your own good. She was making you weak, distracting you from what matters." "What matters?" Reed's voice rose. "You made me throw away the only person who ever truly loved me for who I am, not what I own." Gilbert lunged suddenly, grabbing the papers and rushing toward the shredder in the corner. Reed moved quickly, catching Gilbert's arm. The older man fought with unexpected strength, landing a solid punch to Reed's jaw before slamming him against the edge of the conference table. Pain exploded across Reed's ribs, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He tackled Gilbert, both men crashing to the floor. The struggle was brief, but violent. When it ended, Reed had Gilbert pinned, the incriminating papers clutched in his bloodied hand. "It's over, Gilbert," Reed said, breathing heavily. "The board gets these today. The authorities get them tomorrow." 3 days later, Reed returned to the hospital with a bandaged hand, bruised ribs, and a split lip, but also with news that Gilbert had been removed from the company and was facing criminal charges. Isabel's name had been publicly cleared, the truth finally revealed. "You didn't have to fight him," Isabel said softly, reaching out to touch his bruised face as he sat beside her hospital bed. "Yes, I did," Reed replied. "He hurt you. He hurt us. I couldn't let that stand." Before Isabel was discharged, Reed asked if she'd like to see where he hoped they might come home to, together or separately, whatever she was comfortable with. "I want you to know you have options," he explained. "I've prepared my home for both of you, but I understand if you're not ready for that." Isabel agreed to visit, and when Reed pushed her wheelchair into the nursery he'd created, she gasped. The room was painted in soft yellows and greens, with a handcrafted wooden crib centered beneath a gentle mobile of stars and moons. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with children's classics. A comfortable rocking chair sat in the corner, a handmade quilt draped over its arm. "You did all this?" Isabel whispered, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I wanted her to have a beautiful place, whether you both stay or just visit," Reed said. "There's a room for you too, but no pressure. I can help from a distance if that's what you need." The day Isabel was discharged, Reed surprised her by introducing Maria, her favorite nurse from the maternity ward. "I've arranged for Maria to help during your first few weeks at home," Reed explained. "She's agreed to work private duty, whichever home you choose." Isabel looked at him in amazement. "How did you know I was worried about managing alone?" "I saw your face when the doctor was giving discharge instructions," Reed said simply. "You didn't have to say it." That night, as Isabel watched Reed gently place their daughter in her crib, wincing slightly from his injured ribs, something shifted inside her. This man who had fought for her reputation, who had created a space for their child with such care, who anticipated her needs without her having to voice them. This was the man she had always believed Reed could be. "Your bandages need changing," she said softly, taking his hand. "Let me help you for a change." Over the following months, seasons changed from the crisp autumn days when they brought their daughter home to the first buds of spring. Throughout this time, Reed maintained a careful balance, present and supportive without overstepping. He never pressured Isabel to define their relationship, instead focusing on proving his commitment through actions rather than words. When Isabel mentioned missing her career in event planning, Reed listened intently. The next day, he presented her with business registration papers and startup funding. "This isn't charity," he explained when she hesitated. "It's an investment in your talent. No strings attached. The business is entirely yours." Isabel's new company, Winter Celebrations, quickly gained traction. Reed never interfered but offered connections when asked, and proudly recommended her services to his business associates. He attended every pediatrician appointment, learned to braid their daughter's fine hair, and memorized the bedtime stories she preferred. One afternoon, Isabel arrived early to collect their daughter from Reed's home and overheard voices from his study. She paused in the hallway, recognizing Vanessa's distinctive tone. "This ridiculous family man act has gone on long enough," Vanessa was saying. "We both know you'll get bored playing house eventually. The merger offer still stands. My family's connections, your business acumen." "We made sense, Reed." Isabel held her breath, her old insecurities surfacing. Reed's response came without hesitation. "What makes sense is being with people who value me beyond what I can do for their social standing or business interests," he said firmly. "My daughter and her mother aren't an act or a phase. They're my priority now. Please don't contact me again except through my attorneys." The door opened before Isabel could retreat. Vanessa brushed past with a cold glare, leaving Reed standing in the doorway, surprised to see Isabel. "How much did you hear?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Isabel replied, her voice thick with emotion. Later that same week, Isabel attended a business function where Reed was speaking. She watched from the back as one of his board members approached him after the presentation. "The Patterson shipping empire was built on ruthless decisions," the older man said. "Your father would never have let a woman, especially an ex-wife, distract him from expansion opportunities." Reed's response was immediate and clear. "My father died alone and bitter, surrounded by wealth but no one who genuinely cared for him. I've learned what true success looks like, and it isn't measured in acquisitions." These moments accumulated like treasures Isabel carefully collected, each one helping rebuild what had been shattered between them. One evening, in early spring, they stood together in their daughter's nursery, watching her sleep. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell, her fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. "I've been thinking about that week," Reed said softly. "When Gilbert sabotaged the Richardson deal and we lost millions." Isabel tensed, the memory still painful. "My greatest regret wasn't the money," Reed continued. "It was that I was so consumed with the business crisis that I couldn't see what really mattered. We could have faced it together. We could have been a family all this time." Isabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Wait here," and left the room. She returned with a leather portfolio she placed in his hands. "What's this?" Reed asked. "The proposal I was developing before our divorce," she explained. "The strategy that Richardson implemented after you lost the deal." Reed opened the portfolio, scanning the innovative logistics approach she'd created, the very solution his competitors had used to surpass his market share. But instead of focusing on the missed opportunity, his face lit with admiration. "This is brilliant, Isabel," he said, turning pages with growing excitement. "The intermodal efficiency alone would cut costs by 20%. She studied his face, searching for any sign of resentment that she hadn't shared it sooner. Instead, she found only genuine appreciation of her work. "We could still implement this," Reed suggested, his eyes bright with possibility. "Not just for profit, but to create something meaningful together." In that moment, Isabel finally allowed herself to believe. This was the man she had always glimpsed beneath the ambitious businessman, someone who valued her mind as much as her heart, who saw their daughter not as an obligation, but as a gift, who had truly transformed his priorities. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A partnership." Reed's smile held the promise of everything they might build together, not just a business strategy, but a shared future. Reed spent weeks planning the perfect moment. He chose a Thursday afternoon in early May, exactly 5 years after they'd first met at the city's botanical garden. The weather cooperated with clear skies and gentle sunshine as he led Isabel along the familiar path, their daughter toddling between them, clutching both their hands. "This looks familiar," Isabel said, smiling as they approached a secluded alcove surrounded by blooming azaleas. "It should," Reed replied, his voice slightly unsteady. "This is where you were sketching event layouts when I accidentally spilled coffee on your drawings." He had recreated everything: the checkered blanket spread across the grass, the wicker picnic basket, even the specific pastries from the same bakery they'd visited afterward. Their daughter squealed with delight at the sight of chocolate cookies and plopped down on the blanket. While she was distracted with treats, Reed took Isabel's hand and led her to stand exactly where they had first locked eyes. "5 years ago, I met the woman who would change everything about what I thought mattered in life," he began, his voice low and sincere. "And then I nearly lost her because I couldn't see beyond ambition and pride." Isabel's eyes glistened as Reed knelt before her, not with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to getting his way, but with the vulnerable humility of someone who understood the value of what he was asking for. "I made every mistake possible," he continued, "but somehow, I've been given a second chance I don't deserve. You showed me what real strength looks like, not in business deals or social standing, but in how you loved our daughter, in how you rebuilt your life despite every obstacle, in how you found the courage to trust again." From his pocket, he withdrew not an ostentatious diamond, but a simple platinum band. The inside caught the sunlight, revealing an engraving of their daughter's birth date. "The day she was born was the day I truly understood what matters," Reed explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking if you'll build the rest of our lives together. Not as the man I was, but as the man you've helped me become." Isabel's tears fell freely now as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice, it was steady and certain. "Yes," she whispered, drawing him to his feet. "Yes to our family. Yes to our second chance." 3 months later, they stood together in the garden of the home they now shared. No elaborate floral displays or society photographers crowded the space. Just close friends and family gathered in intimate celebration. Their daughter served as flower girl, scattering petals with enthusiastic abandon before running to stand between them during the ceremony. Reed's vows acknowledged the journey that had brought them back together. "I once mistook success for happiness," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "I valued status over authentic connection. But standing here today, I know that the true measure of a life well lived is found in the people who choose to walk beside you, especially when the path gets difficult." At the reception, Reed held Isabel close as they swayed to their first dance. "Do you know what the luckiest moment of my life was?" he whispered against her hair. "What?" she asked, looking up at him. "Seeing you clearing tables at my rehearsal dinner," he said with absolute conviction. "It woke me from the empty existence I'd been living. It brought me back to you." Their kiss, witnessed by friends who had supported them through their journey, sealed not just their vows, but the promise of the family they were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, I found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how... If you enjoyed this story, I found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.